This is where things stand in the Middle East as of the middle of July 2026, and there's a lot to get through. So let's take it piece by piece, starting with the fighting itself before we move into the money, the diplomacy, and the harder questions underneath all of it. The war between the United States and Iran did not start this week. It has been running since the end of February, when American and Israeli strikes killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with a wave of attacks on Iranian military infrastructure. Iran's answer at the time was to close the Strait of Hormuz to foreign shipping, and the Revolutionary Guard Corps began broadcasting warnings over marine radio telling vessels that no ship was allowed through. The British Royal Navy pushed back on that, noting the closure had no legal standing, though it also acknowledged it could not guarantee safety for ships that tried anyway. That tension between a closure Iran claims the right to enforce and an international shipping law that says otherwise has essentially defined the crisis ever since. It never really went away, even during the weeks when a fragile truce was holding. That truce broke down hard in the second week of July. Iran fired on a Cyprus-flagged container ship transiting the strait, leaving one crew member missing, and the Revolutionary Guard said it had fired a warning shot at a vessel it accused of using an unauthorized route, then declared the strait closed again. The United States responded with a third round of strikes that week, hitting roughly 140 targets across Iran by American accounts. From there, it kept escalating. Iranian forces struck 2 tankers flying the flag of the United Arab Emirates while they sat in Omani waters, killing an Indian crew member aboard one of them, and the Guard claimed separately to have disabled 2 rogue supertankers that had switched off their navigation systems. Threats and interceptions spread outward to Jordan, Bahrain, Qatar, and Kuwait, each of which reported either activating air defenses or intercepting something inbound. By the middle of the week, American forces had completed a 5th consecutive night of strikes, this time aimed specifically at degrading Iran's ability to threaten shipping, hitting command centers, air defense sites, missile and drone facilities, and coastal surveillance positions, including targets around Bandar Abbas, and a 90-minute operation against Greater Tunb Island. Air raid sirens were reported in Tehran itself in the early hours that followed. It's worth pausing on why the fighting keeps spreading sideways instead of staying contained to a single front. The American military posture in the Gulf was built deliberately not to be concentrated in one place. Air defense batteries, fuel depots, command infrastructure, and munitions are spread across bases in Jordan, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, and the wider Gulf, specifically so that no single strike can knock out the whole operation at once. Iran's answer to that has been to spread its own retaliation the same way, forcing Washington and its regional partners to defend multiple fronts simultaneously rather than concentrating resources on offense. And the targets Iran says it's hitting are not random either. Claims of strikes on Patriot batteries, radar systems, fuel storage, and logistics hubs point to an attempt to degrade the systems that let a base function day to day, not just the runways themselves. A damaged runway can be patched in hours. A damaged fuel or communications network takes much longer to rebuild, and that's presumably the point. On the American side, the target set has shifted too, from what looked like a pre-planned opening wave back in February to something closer to continuous, real-time targeting of threats as they reappear. That's a meaningful distinction. A single scripted strike package suggests an attempt to achieve a defined military objective and then stop. Continuous operations against emerging targets suggest an open-ended campaign with no fixed endpoint, which tends to be much harder to walk back diplomatically because there's no natural pause to negotiate around. Then there's the water itself, which is really where the economic stakes of this whole conflict live. About 1/5 of the world's oil and a large share of its liquefied natural gas moves through the Strait of Hormuz. So any disruption there ripples immediately into global energy prices. President Trump had floated the idea of charging a 20% fee on every cargo passing through the strait as a kind of American toll on the waterway. But that idea was dropped in favor of something narrower and, frankly, more complicated to execute. A blockade aimed specifically at vessels connected to Iran, while declaring the strait open to everyone else. On paper, that sounds cleaner than a blanket toll. In practice, it's a much harder intelligence problem. A general fee just needs a collection mechanism. A targeted blockade needs to know who actually owns a ship, what cargo is aboard, where it last called, and who the ultimate buyer is. And Iran has spent years building exactly the kind of layered ownership structures, flag hopping, and ship-to-ship transfers designed to make those questions difficult to answer. When a tanker switches off its transponder or changes course far from any port, that creates a signal that maritime intelligence can pick up on. But proving the Iran connection well enough to justify boarding or disabling a vessel is a slower, more contested process than firing a missile at a fixed installation. The reported disabling of an oil tanker sailing toward Karg Island, which is one of Iran's main oil export terminals, fits into that pattern. Not a blanket closure, but a selective campaign against the ships and infrastructure that keep Iranian oil revenue flowing. Oil markets have moved with every twist of this story, spiking toward the high 80s per barrel when the toll idea and the worst of the strikes hit headlines, then easing back down once Washington stepped away from the blanket fee. Ship owners and charterers have been pausing transits altogether rather than risk vessels, in a strait where 2 flagged tankers were just hit while sitting in what should have been safe Omani waters. War risk insurance premiums for the route are climbing, which functions as its own kind of tax on global trade, regardless of what any government formally imposes. China and Oman have both been pushing, from different angles, for a return to normal shipping traffic, with Beijing framing continued disruption as a threat to energy supply and pricing across Asia, and Oman trying to broker an arrangement that restores freedom of navigation without handing either Washington or Tehran a clean political win. That triangulation matters because it shows this isn't simply a two-country standoff. It's a choke point that a huge share of the global economy depends on, which is exactly why both the United States and Iran keep describing their actions there in terms of protecting, rather than closing, international shipping, even as their military actions do the opposite for large parts of the shipping industry. Now to the money war, which gets less attention than the missiles, but may matter just as much over time. Ali Khamenei's death back in February brought his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, to the position of supreme leader, and the sanctions campaign now underway is aimed squarely at the financial architecture that supports him and the people around him. The central figure is Ali Ansari, a Dubai-based Iranian banker the U.S. Treasury has named as a key financier for the new supreme leader and other senior regime figures. According to Treasury's account, Ansari built much of his position through Allende Bank, an institution that collapsed in 2025 under a mountain of bad debt and was ultimately shut down by the Iranian government itself. And he is accused of routing wealth through an overseas portfolio of real estate and commercial holdings, including a holding company based in St. Kitts and Nevis to benefit himself, regime insiders, and the Revolutionary Guard. Alongside Ansari, Treasury designated a set of Iranian shadow exchange houses, companies that reportedly move billions of dollars a year on behalf of already sanctioned Iranian banks by layering transactions through shell companies and intermediaries in places like Hong Kong and the UAE. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent framed the goal explicitly as isolating the new supreme leader and regime elites from the global financial system while preserving the seized assets, in the department's telling, for the Iranian people rather than the state. There's an important wrinkle here worth being straightforward about. These sanctions came after the U.S. and Iran had signed a memorandum of understanding that included a pause on new fighting and a formal commitment from Washington not to impose new sanctions during a 60-day negotiating window. This action is reportedly the first new sanctions package since that agreement was signed, and it landed just after Iran resumed attacks on shipping in the Strait. Depending on which side you ask, that sequence either shows Washington responding proportionately to a return to hostilities that Iran initiated, or it shows an agreement quietly eroding on both sides at once, with each party pointing to the other's move as the justification for its own. Reasonable people, looking at the same set of facts, land in different places on that, and it's the kind of dispute where the sequencing genuinely is contested rather than settled. Setting the political framing aside, the mechanics of financial sanctions like this are worth understanding on their own terms, because they work differently from a missile strike. The direct effect is that any U.S. person or institution is now barred from doing business with the named individuals and entities, but the larger effect tends to be indirect. Once someone appears on a sanctions list, international banks, insurers, and asset managers everywhere become reluctant to touch anything connected to them out of fear of secondary exposure, even in jurisdictions that aren't formally bound by U.S. law. That's the theory behind targeting a financial facilitator, rather than just freezing an account. The goal is to make an entire network radioactive to the global banking system, not just to grab one pot of money. Whether that succeeds against a network built for exactly this kind of pressure, with layered ownership and jurisdictions chosen for opacity, is genuinely uncertain. And it's worth being honest that sanctions campaigns against Iran's elite have had a mixed record over the past 2 decades. They've clearly imposed real costs and complicated regime finances, but they haven't, on their own, changed core Iranian behavior in past cycles either. There's also a broader regional dimension to the sanctions push. Iraq sits in an uncomfortable position here, because its banking and currency exchange networks have long served as a bridge connecting Iran's economy to the dollar-based international system and to Arab markets. Iraq's new prime minister was in Washington around the same time these strikes and sanctions were unfolding, and the pressure on him is real, the more aggressively the U.S. Treasury expands enforcement toward Iraqi intermediaries, the more Baghdad has to choose, in a very concrete and public way, between protecting its own banking relationships with the West and tolerating continued Iranian financial activity on its soil. Britain has been moving in a parallel direction, advancing legislation that would allow prosecution of anyone found materially assisting the Revolutionary Guard's activities inside the UK, building on years of accusations that the Guard's Quds force has been linked to surveillance and intimidation operations against dissidents and Jewish communities in Europe. None of that is proof of any specific incident, but it reflects a broader European shift toward treating the Guard's overseas activity as a security threat in its own right, separate from the war itself. Let's move to Lebanon, which is running on a track that is connected to the Iran war but has its own logic. This didn't start this week either. When Israel and the US opened their campaign against Iran at the end of February, Hezbollah renewed rocket and drone attacks against Israel days later in early March, and Israel responded with an extensive campaign against Hezbollah's commanders, weapons depots, and cross-border infrastructure, eventually occupying a security buffer roughly 10 kilometers deep along the length of the Lebanese border. Israel says that zone is necessary because it protects northern Israeli communities from exactly the kind of attacks Hezbollah has carried out before. Lebanon, understandably, wants its sovereign territory back and describes the occupation, including reports of controlled demolitions of entire villages inside the zone, as a humanitarian and political wound that undermines the very state authority the diplomatic process is supposed to be strengthening. Both of those things are true at once, and that tension is the whole story of the Lebanon track. In late June, Lebanon and Israel reached what's being called a framework agreement in Washington, laying out a sequence. Israeli forces would withdraw from southern Lebanon in exchange for the disarmament of Hezbollah and other armed groups, with Lebanese army units taking over on the ground, and an eventual path towards some kind of formal peace between two countries that technically remain in a state of war 8 decades after Israel's founding. The plan was designed to start small, with 2 so-called pilot zones, limited areas where the Lebanese army would take control after clearing out any Hezbollah presence, functioning as a proof of concept before anything wider. Implementation stalled after that agreement, which is why Israeli and Lebanese delegations sat down again in Rome in the middle of July, their 6th round of direct talks since the fighting resumed in March. Lebanese President Joseph Aoun went in with instructions for his delegation to demand an immediate Israeli withdrawal from the 2 pilot zones before discussing anything further, while Israel's position going in was that any pullback depends on Hezbollah no longer posing a threat to Israeli communities. After 2 days of talks at the U.S. Embassy, the 2 sides reportedly agreed on the structure and guidelines for how a withdrawal from the pilot zones would work, with American officials calling the round productive, and a U.S. military delegation had already been in Lebanon coordinating details with the Lebanese army beforehand. But there was no firm timeline attached to any of it by the time the talks wrapped, and the sides reportedly discussed without finalizing how a third party, possibly involving United Nations forces, might verify that the pilot zones are actually free of Hezbollah weapons and fighters once Lebanese troops take over. That verification question is really the crux of the whole plan, because the entire arrangement depends on Israel trusting that Lebanese control genuinely means Hezbollah has been cleared out, not just that its fighters have gone temporarily quiet. Hezbollah itself has rejected the framework agreement outright, arguing that it compromises Lebanese sovereignty and improperly ties an end to Israel's military presence to the group's own disarmament, which it considers a separate question tied to its role resisting Israel rather than something to be negotiated away. From Hezbollah's perspective and from Iran's, keeping the Lebanon question folded into the wider regional file, rather than settled as a purely internal Lebanese matter, preserves leverage. As long as Beirut's security decisions are entangled with what happens between Washington and Tehran, Hezbollah retains a stronger hand than it would have negotiating from Lebanon alone. Aoun is trying to pull the opposite direction, arguing that Lebanon's security decisions should be made in Beirut by Lebanese institutions rather than dictated from Tehran or held hostage to the broader Iran negotiation. He's due in Washington on July 21st to meet President Trump directly, hoping to use that meeting to press for a firmer, faster Israeli withdrawal and to secure American backing, reconstruction funding, and international support for the Lebanese army's expanded role. Saudi Arabia has an interest in seeing that succeed too, since reducing Iranian and Hezbollah influence over Lebanese state decisions has been a long-standing Saudi objective, though Riyadh's financial and diplomatic support can smooth the path without being able to resolve what is ultimately an internal Lebanese contest over who actually controls the country's decisions about war and peace. Now to Gaza, which connects to all of this in a less direct but still meaningful way. The IDF has continued targeted operations against Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, figures it identifies as involved in rebuilding military capability, including strikes described as targeting commanders tied to planning and weapons production, and operations against armed cells and local enforcement structures that help Hamas maintain day-to-day control over Gaza's population, even as talk of a technocratic governing body continues in the background. It's worth being clear about the limits of independent verification here. Claims about who specifically was targeted and what role each person played come primarily from Israeli military statements. And as with most reporting on strikes inside Gaza, That reporting deserves the same caution applied to any single-source military claim, whichever side is making it. There have also been reports, including from Hamas-adjacent and Iranian channels, describing a meeting between senior Hamas officials and Iranian regime figures around the time of Khamenei's funeral proceedings, in which Hamas is said to have pressed for its position to be folded into any broader settlement between Iran and the United States, for continued funding and supply routes, and for a guarantee that any post-war arrangement would not require it to surrender its weapons. Those specific details are harder to independently confirm than the strike reporting or the Rome talks, and they should be treated with real caution rather than presented as settled fact. What is a defensible, broader observation is that Iran's strategy across Lebanon and Gaza alike has consistently been to link these fronts together rather than let each be resolved on its own separate terms, which raises the cost of any single settlement and preserves Tehran's leverage across the region as a whole. Israel's stated objective, meanwhile, has been the opposite: to separate each arena so that Lebanon's security questions get resolved in Beirut, Gaza's governance question gets resolved with leadership not subordinate to Hamas, and Iraq's financial exposure to Iranian networks gets addressed without any one front's outcome being held hostage to the others. So where does that leave things, taken together? On the military side, there's a real escalation ladder still very much active, moving from straight skirmishes to strikes on power infrastructure to attacks reaching American bases across multiple countries in a matter of hours, and neither side has shown clear signs of wanting to be the one to de-escalate first. On the economic side, there's a genuinely difficult transition underway from a blunt instrument, the 20% transit fee, to a more surgical one, a targeted blockade against Iran-linked shipping, and that shift trades simplicity for precision in a way that will take time to prove whether it actually works, given how much effort Iran has already put into obscuring ship ownership. On the financial side, there's a slower but potentially more durable campaign aimed at making it harder for Iran's leadership and the Revolutionary Guard to move money internationally at all, layered on top of, and arguably in tension with, a diplomatic memorandum that was supposed to freeze new sanctions during a negotiating window. And, on the diplomatic side, there are two separate but connected negotiating tracks, one in Lebanon that produced real, if incomplete, progress in Rome and now moves into more technical talks, and one around Gaza that remains far less resolved, with Hamas continuing to resist any arrangement that would require it to give up either its weapons or its grip on day-to-day control. None of these tracks exist in isolation, and that's really the through line here. A missile fired at a tanker in the Strait affects oil prices that shape how much pressure Washington is willing to apply through sanctions. A sanctions package announced mid-negotiation affects whether Tehran believes the diplomatic track is worth staying in. Progress or failure in the Rome talks over Lebanon shapes whether Hezbollah stays quiet or reopens a northern front against Israel, which would immediately change the calculus for everyone involved in the Iran fight further east. And Hamas, watching how much leverage Hezbollah manages to extract from linking itself to the Iran file, will shape how much incentive Hamas has to hold out rather than negotiate over Gaza's future on its own. Each front is being fought partly on its own terms, and partly as a bargaining chip in every other front, which is exactly the dynamic that makes this conflict so much harder to resolve through any single ceasefire or agreement than a more contained two-party war would be. There are a few things worth watching closely in the days ahead, regardless of which side of any of these arguments a person finds more persuasive. The first is whether the pilot zones in southern Lebanon actually launch, and on what verification terms, since that's the most concrete, testable commitment to have come out of any of these negotiating tracks so far, and a real, on-the-ground handover would be a meaningful signal that at least one front is moving from words to implementation. The second is what happens with Joseph Aoun's meeting with President Trump on July 21st, since Aoun has been explicit that he needs a tangible American commitment to bring home to a Lebanese public that has grown skeptical of promises without follow-through. The third is whether the targeted blockade in the Strait actually manages to distinguish Iran-linked shipping from everyone else's, or whether the difficulty of that intelligence problem ends up looking, in practice, closer to a blanket disruption regardless of the stated policy, which would keep global energy markets on edge regardless of how the policy is officially described. And the fourth is simply whether the financial sanctions campaign against Ansari and the Exchange House network produces any visible strain inside Iran's ruling structure, or whether, as has happened in past sanctions rounds, the network route around it adapts and continues operating largely as before. It's also worth spending a moment on the human cost that tends to get compressed into a single line in coverage that's moving this fast. The crisis around the Strait alone has, by tallies compiled since the closure was first declared back in February, involved more than a dozen merchant ships damaged, several of them abandoned by their crews, at least one tugboat sunk, a couple of vessels seized outright, and more than a dozen seafarers killed or reported missing, along with port workers hurt in strikes reaching as far as Bahrain. Those are not soldiers or combatants in any formal sense. They're merchant crews, often drawn from countries with no direct stake in the underlying dispute, who happen to be on the water when a missile or a mine finds a ship. That's part of why Oman and China keep pushing so hard for some kind of restored freedom of navigation, regardless of how the broader political dispute resolves. The costs of keeping the strait contested fall disproportionately on shipping industries and crews that aren't party to the fight at all, and on economies far from the Gulf that depend on stable energy prices. The picture in southern Lebanon carries its own human cost that's easy to lose inside the language of buffer zones and pilot zones. Israel's occupation of that roughly 10-kilometer strips has meant displacement for Lebanese families who live there, and reporting on the ground has described controlled demolitions leveling entire villages inside the zone, which Israel frames as a security necessity to deny Hezbollah any physical infrastructure to rebuild from, and which Lebanese officials and residents describe as a punishing and disproportionate cost imposed on communities that, in many cases, had no say in Hezbollah's decision to reopen the front in early March. Whichever framing a person finds more persuasive, the practical reality is that a large number of Lebanese civilians are currently unable to return home, and the pace at which that changes will depend entirely on how quickly and how completely the pilot zone concept actually gets implemented once the technical talks that followed Rome get underway. It's also worth stepping back to ask why this round of the broader conflict looks different from the pattern of Iran-Israel and Iran-U.S. tension that's played out episodically for decades. Iran and Israel fought largely through proxies and shadow operations for a long time, and direct, sustained state-on-state strikes of the kind seen since February represent a real break from that pattern. The assassination of Iran's supreme leader in the opening days of the war is itself a marker of just how far this round has already gone past prior rounds of tension, which typically stopped well short of targeting the top of Iran's political and religious hierarchy. That single fact reshapes almost everything downstream of it. Iran is not simply defending territory or proxies in this fight, it's operating under new, less experienced leadership at the very top, transitioning from Ali Khamenei to his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, in the middle of an active war, which is a genuinely unusual and destabilizing situation for any state to be managing, let alone one already under this much military and economic pressure. Whether that succession makes Iran's decision-making more cautious, because a new leader has less accumulated authority to spend on further escalation, or less predictable, because the normal internal checks that come with an established leader's standing are weaker, is one of the more consequential open questions hanging over everything else described here, and it's simply too early in that transition to know which way it will break. There's a comparable question sitting on the American and Israeli side, which is how much appetite exists domestically and among regional partners for a campaign that has now run for months without producing a clear, stated end state. The shift Washington has described, from a planned opening strike package to continuous, real-time operations against re-emerging threats, is the kind of posture that tends to be sustainable only as long as the cost, in dollars, in risk to American personnel and regional partners, and in economic disruption to allies who depend on Gulf energy and shipping, stays below whatever threshold decision-makers are willing to tolerate. Trump's own framing, that Iran had a nearly finalized agreement and then backed away from it before firing first, is one that will keep getting tested against whatever comes out of any future attempt to restart negotiations, and it's the kind of claim that's genuinely difficult for anyone outside the closed-door talks to verify independently in either direction. For the Gulf states caught in the middle, geography alone means they can't simply opt out of this. Jordan, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE have all now had incidents on their own territory or in their own waters, air defense activations, missile interceptions, tanker strikes, none of which they chose to be part of, and each of which puts their own governments in the position of managing a relationship with Washington, a relationship with Tehran, and their own domestic politics all at once, usually with very little advance warning before the next round of strikes puts them back in the news. The new economic arrangement between Washington and the Gulf states, referenced amid all of this, though details of it remain thin from what's publicly available, points toward an American effort to keep those governments aligned with Washington's approach to the Strait, even as the costs of that alignment land, quite literally, on their own coastlines and in their own airspace. Pulling all of that together, the honest summary is that there isn't a tidy resolution visible on any of these four fronts right now: the military campaign around the Strait, the financial pressure campaign against Iran's leadership, the Lebanon negotiating track, or the Gaza standoff. There's real, verifiable movement on some of them, a structural agreement on how the Lebanese pilot zones might work, a concrete new set of sanctions designations, a documented pattern of nightly strikes with specific targets named. And there's a great deal that remains genuinely contested, unresolved, or simply unknown, including how Iran's untested new leadership will ultimately choose to respond to sustained pressure, whether the shift to a targeted blockade actually holds up under the intelligence demands it places on the U.S. Navy and its partners, and whether either Hezbollah or Hamas can be separated in practice rather than just on paper from a broader Iranian strategy that has every incentive to keep every front linked to every other one. What's clear is that this is not a single war with a single front and a single off-ramp. It's several overlapping conflicts, military, economic, financial, and diplomatic, running on their own timelines but constantly feeding into one another, involving not just the United States and Iran, but Israel, Lebanon, Hezbollah, Hamas, Iraq, Britain, Oman, China, and the shipping companies and insurers whose decisions about which routes to use are quietly shaping global oil prices in the background of all of it. Anyone trying to follow this closely is better served tracking each of those threads on its own terms, rather than looking for one single headline that resolves all of them at once, because that headline, at least for now, doesn't appear to be coming. Both Washington and Tehran describe their own actions as defensive and the other side's as the provocation. And both Israel and Hezbollah, and separately Israel and Hamas, tell mirror image versions of that same story about who bears responsibility for the fighting continuing. None of that ambiguity should obscure the concrete facts on the ground. The strikes that have happened, the tankers that have been hit, the sanctions that have been issued, the talks that concluded in Rome without a firm timeline attached. But it's worth holding on to the fact that almost everything described as a fixed, settled truth in the heat of a fast-moving week like this one is actually still being argued over by the people living through it, and that's likely to remain true for a while yet, however this particular week's headlines eventually settle.